All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian has asked me to review the Ted Cruz interview with Tucker Carlson, which is a fascinating and highly educational back and forth. It's not short. There are many videos I review here that I don't necessarily recommend. I'm like, oh yeah, you can watch it if you're interested. You can take a look, but not worthwhile. This is one that probably is worth watching, and I'll include a link in the description bar below. You can check that out. You don't have to check it out before. It's not like plot spoilers or anything like that. But it's a very, very interesting back and forth. Partially because, and Tucker Carlson's great at this. The first time I really took an interest in Tucker Carlson and decided I liked him was when he did a similar kind of adversarial interview. It was more of a friendly debate, I should say, with Ben Shapiro about economics and labor. This was years and years ago. This is like 5 or 6 years ago or so. And Ben Shapiro was at that time the kind of benchmark Republican talking point giver. You don't disagree with Ben Shapiro. I mean, many of us did, but like not in public, and not successfully. He was held up as he's not even. We won't talk about Ben Shapiro, but then Tucker Carlson comes on and makes talking points that in other contexts would get you called like a leftist or something, talking about labor and caring for the workers of the United States, which is just a nationalist position. It's not inherently leftist at all. And he was making it from a kind of right of center perspective. And he did it very well. And so I was impressed by that. And I like these kinds of debates where they are between sides that nominally agree with each other. So like Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson are both on the right. And so is, of course, Ted Cruz. So here we have another one of those. So it's interesting, I think, on its face to see those kinds of things, because when you begin on the same side, you much more often end up in a real debate where it's not just ships passing in the night and two people with completely different value systems just talking past each other. There's more substantive clashing of information, of perspectives, of all that kind of thing. And that's kind of what we got here. But there is something unusual about this interview. What are we watching exactly? They are two nominal political allies and supposedly friends, but they're clashing in ways that are not just ideological, but they feel almost personal in a few places. Now, the nominal subjects of this discussion were, America's foreign policy. It was intervention in Iraq, a good idea. How about Syria? And it really kicks off with Tucker Carlson jumps straight to Iran. What's this about invading Iran? And they talk a little bit about Russia. I think they mentioned China at one point, but the big one is not so much Iran, but Israel, and that's where things get strangely personal and religious a little bit. The sections that were getting clipped were not the most interesting, I don't think. I mean, that's kind of how the internet works, right? The one that got clipped was when Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz had explained his, very tediously explained that he was supportive of regime change in Iran, but not supportive of any kind of military or other action to kinetically cause a regime change. Well, sanctions, we can bring it to its knees economically and pressure it into regime change, which is okay. But and Tucker Carlson asked, what's the population of Iran? And Ted Cruz says, I don't know that. And it became a meme. And it's both Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz are very crafty with their language and very skillful. And I don't mean that as a criticism. They were well matched, and I don't think it's dishonest or bad to be crafty and skillful in this way. It's just something to be aware of. The asking the population of Iran, that's not the kind of thing that people are going to know offhand usually, and even people who are well educated about a place. And it's not the kind of thing you have to know when you're making geopolitical decisions, because the people in charge of Iran and in charge of Iran's military are not the whole of the population. It's a very, very small percentage of it. Ask Ted Cruz about, Khomeini and about, aspects of their government, and he could probably list that offhand, because that's the politically and geostrategically relevant information. So it's a bit of a lame gotcha. Now, obviously, there is a tie-in where you could argue that it is relevant because, America's misunderstanding of the population and ethnic breakdown. And Tucker Carlson did follow it up with an ethnic breakdown question. What is the predominant ethnicity and religiosity of Iran? And Ted Cruz didn't know that either. And that's like, okay, we might have some like Iraq subject matter tie-in there, but that's kind of metaphor thinking. Like, Iran is not the same as Iraq. The mission of, if America were to invade Iran, would not be the same as the mission of invading Iraq. So the crossover is actually less relevant than a lot of people think it is offhand. But it did, that back and forth did elicit a confession of sorts from Ted Cruz that we were engaging in direct military action along with Israel against Iran, despite the United States government declaring that we were not. And Tucker Carlson very, very astutely said, well, this is breaking news. And that was like the real gotcha. But the sort of scholarly question, if you want to focus on like the nominal subject matter here, is this isolationism versus interventionism question. And Tucker Carlson took great umbrage at the word isolationist. I think that was a little bit unfair. I think Ted Cruz is perfectly fine using the term isolationist. I think a great many people self-describe themselves as isolationists, so it's not a term of denigration. And it's certainly no more so than interventionist. Interventionist is arguably even more insulting because it implies that you just want to intervene everywhere. I just want to intervene. Obviously, it's a matter of disposition. I don't think anybody in the United States is a true, pure isolationist, and nobody is an absolute interventionist either. It's about which places you want to go and why. And that was the sort of intelligent place that they both finally ended up at. And, I actually thought Ted Cruz's assertion that Tucker Carlson was overcorrecting after getting Iraq wrong, and kudos to Tucker Carlson for correcting in that way. I think it's fantastic and wonderful when people make a bad call in public, learn from it, and correct in public. But you can overcorrect. And so kudos to Tucker Carlson for doing that correction. And kudos to Ted Cruz for, I think, getting a directionally correct psychoanalysis of Tucker Carlson. But that doesn't mean that Tucker Carlson is wrong. And it doesn't mean that going into Iran is in America's best interest, which is, of course, the subject of the discussion, the real subject. What is in America's interest? And, there was this line that we would hear that Christopher Hitchens used to make fun of back in the days of the War on Terror. You fight them over there so you don't have to fight them here. Christopher Hitchens like, that's stupid. It's you fight them or you don't fight them. It's going to be over here whether we fight them over there or not. But that's to sort of do away with this kind of promise that is implicit in many of the interventionists that if we engage them over there, then we'll have less things to deal with over here. Not necessarily true. Whereas the isolationists will say, no. If you intervene, you will create enemies, which bring more conflict back home. Is one of these true? Is the other one true? Are they both true? Are neither of them true? I don't know. I don't know what the relationship is between interventionism and domestic problems. What Tucker Carlson was focusing on, and this is, I think, an extremely reasonable and important point, is the misalignment of priorities. We're talking about how messy and crime-ridden Washington, D.C. is. And we're sending all this money, billions of dollars to Ukraine, billions of dollars to Israel, while our own streets are second world countries in many places. Where is the focus here? And, it turns out that, international affairs and domestic affairs might be interrelated in more ways than one. And that brings us not to Iran, Syria, Iraq, China, or Russia, but Israel. Because where things got really interesting and really kind of heated in this back and forth was when Tucker Carlson started asking questions about AIPAC. AIPAC is the American Israel PAC, basically. It's a political action committee for facilitating American-Israeli relations, which is it's an Israeli foreign lobby. It is a lobby for Israel, despite Ted Cruz's vehement denials that was the case. No, it's about the relationship between America and Israel. It's not for Israel. That would be like cigarette companies, lobbying for the relationships between Americans and their cigarettes. That is weasel nonsense, and he knows it, and everybody knows it. That's ridiculous weasel language to pretend that AIPAC is anything other than a foreign lobby, which I believe makes it illegal. But this weasel language that he is reciting is actually legal language that allows it, special exemptions and whatever. But that weasel language itself is and there was this whole subject of Israel brought up another bit of weasel language, which was not just interesting in the weasel language, but interesting in how quickly and effectively Tucker Carlson was able to respond to it. And that was when Ted Cruz accused Tucker Carlson of being obsessed with Israel. And Tucker Carlson very, very quickly jujitsu'd him and said, I'm obsessed with Israel? Who's the one who went into office claiming they were going to be, the biggest supporter of Israel in Congress? That doesn't sound like me being obsessed with Israel. But the obsession with Israel very quickly turned, and then Ted Cruz said something about, it's the Jews, which Tucker Carlson immediately picked up as that's an insinuation of anti-Semitism. You're accusing me of being anti-Semitic because you think this concern about this illegal foreign lobby is I'm only concerned about that because of the race involved. I must hate Jews. And he immediately picked up on that, and Ted Cruz tried to say, "Oh no, I didn't accuse you of being anti-Semitic." And Tucker Carlson stuck with his guns and said, "Yes, you did. Yes, you did." And within a minute, Ted Cruz basically just called him an anti-Semite. So it was funny how the mask kind of fell there, and the insinuation got picked up and called out immediately, and Tucker Carlson stuck to his guns on calling out the insinuation when Ted Cruz tried to retreat in his Mott and Bailey anti-Semitism game to saying, "Oh no, I didn't." So, and again, this is why I was saying earlier, Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson are both very skillful, very crafty, and this wasn't just one-sided either. Ted Cruz actually called out some things that Tucker Carlson did, and he said, "Oh, you're doing that very condescending laugh," and Tucker Carlson amazingly said, "You know what? You're right. I'm sorry. It's a tick. I need to stop that." I was like, cool, nice, cool to see that kind of thing. But of course, that little moment of kindness doesn't undo the pattern of weaselness going on here. So again, what is it that we're watching here? Why is this interaction so strange? And maybe it doesn't come across as strange to other people, as it did to me, I guess. But I felt like I was seeing Tucker Carlson approach these topics in a fairly open and open-minded and empowered manner. Whereas Ted Cruz, as a politician, is constrained. And I don't mean just constrained, in terms of socially what he's allowed to say or else he'll risk not getting elected. I mean constrained legally, which he broke in one case, admitting that America had helped in Israel in an attack on Iran, which he wasn't supposed to say. But the constituency thing is also there. And what I thought was the most interesting part of this interview, the biggest claim, was when Tucker Carlson had asked him, have you received money from AIPAC? And Ted Cruz says, well, yes, I have, but, don't misunderstand what's going on when you see me receiving money from AIPAC. It's not like they pay me, so therefore I do what they want. I had these positions going in. I came into office saying I was going to support Israel, and so AIPAC saw, hey, here's a congressman who is supporting Israel, so let's send him money. But he didn't change. He came in with these, of course, but that's its own little bit of clever sneakiness, because smart politicians choose their platforms based on what platforms are likely to bring in money from different donor classes. So it's actually a distinction without a difference. And Ted Cruz, he has this metaphor, something from a movie, where a corrupt politician's like, all right, what position do I take? And his advisor says, it doesn't matter what position you take. We can shake down people for money based on whichever position you take. Sort of to support his position that these donors are not changing the positions of politicians. They're just supporting the politicians that happen to already coincide with their aims, which again, I think is a difference without a distinction. But when you think about how politicians campaign for power in the first place. But the other problem on top of that Ted Cruz doesn't address is, what about all the politicians that change very suddenly? Wasn't there an extraordinary difference between 2008 Obama and 2014 Obama. Not exactly the same policies. What about, just to pick a subject from this last week, how about Trump and Dan Bongino and Kash Patel and the Epstein client list? What about that list on your desk, Pam Bondi? Do we have a change of heart there? Now that might be, new information has arisen or something. But it could also be what the clients say. It could also be where the power comes from. And so these constraints upon the politician seem to speak through the politician even above the individual. And I felt like I was watching, when you listen to a politician talk, and when they speak, everything flows together in a way that sounds so coherent. But if you lay it out in like a bullet list of their policies, there's no coherence at all. It's like this weird hodgepodge with no coherent worldview. It feels like that's why. It feels like they have stitched together a constituency made up of various different demographics with various different interests. So they have to stitch together a policy list that benefits these constituencies. And the art of politics seems to be the art of crafting a believable enough. It doesn't even need to be like very believable. It just needs to kind of give the feeling of believability, of some narrative that brings all those things together. If it reminds you of a literary character, good on you. One object to bring all the other things together and bind them. Well, we are talking about power after all. And it's not as if journalists don't have this pressure too, especially the politically captured ones, of which there are many. Tucker Carlson seems to be less so than most, but I would be shocked if he's entirely free from those kinds of hard or soft pressures. So, it's, I feel like this debate if you go after listening to this, if you do decide to go and watch the debate, watch for the presence of these pressures in Ted Cruz. Listen to the theology he brings up. I always cringe. I used to cringe when I heard any politician talk theology. It's always dumb. But why would a politician bring up such a bad theological point against some? And maybe it's because he's not used to being challenged on theology. It's not usually good taste to challenge someone's theology like that. When you're saying it so casually about how God will bless those who bless Israel, Tucker Carlson's like, you mean the government of Israel, or do you mean the people? But do you think there are many people that are making fun of Ted Cruz for this bad theology? It's like, oh my gosh, these dispensationalists, how can they think these dumb things? But think about it from the perspective of politics. Do you think that is his actual personal belief? I think if you put him to a lie detector, he might pass as saying that's his real belief. But I doubt that's how it started. I think he arrived at that talking point because it was a necessary thread to stitch together that constituency we were talking about before. And so, when that belief is necessary, the brain will rationalize and find a way, and probably come through on the other side, maybe even believing that sincerely, maybe even getting high on his own supply of political bullshit. But I doubt it started that way. I doubt that was his deeply held theological belief. It's just a quick little thing you can throw out, food for the base of a particular class, and it gives plausibility to allegiances that are useful for other reasons. So I do encourage people to watch this as an exercise in spotting the presence of these pressures and the tendency that these pressures have to create weasel language, because it has to. Because when you're constructing a constituency or a narrative based on unlike and even opposed parts, think of the left, which is appealing simultaneously to gays and to Muslims. One of these wants to throw the other one off the roof. Okay, how do you bring those two together? Well, you have to be a really, really good narrative crafter, right? And that always results in weasel language, because the reality of these two groups is that they are mutually exclusive. So, when you can spot the powers in the background speaking through the characters, it makes it easier to detect the weasel language. And I'm gonna recommend two other videos that are related to this and are useful. One is more entertainment and one is more educational. The two rules I think that are useful in watching a discussion like this is, first of all, always keep track of the subject. So much the weasel language is very sneaky subject changes, very sneaky ways to shift. Oh, this is no longer about Israel. This is now about you and your opinion about Jews, for example, if you're Ted Cruz. And my favorite example of someone just absolutely bulldozing through those attempts at weasel language is an old interview, I believe it was from 1986, on Crossfire with Frank Zappa. This was back when they were trying to ban certain words from radio, I think. And the guy who was sort of interrogating and debating Frank Zappa was like, "Oh, look at these music videos; they're so obscene." And Frank Zappa was just like, "This is not about music videos. The law in question is about words. We're talking about words." And every time the guys tried to make it about something else, Frank Zappa would persistently bring it back to the actual subject in question. And it's a valuable, it takes a degree of perspective, and it takes a degree of experience, and it takes a degree of being able to hold multiple things in your head at the same time. Because if someone brings up another subject, you have to still be holding the context in which you're having that subject in your head simultaneously, and being able to keep everything oriented in your head. It's a skill that takes practice, but it's very valuable, because so much of people being just led off by red herrings in other directions and distracted is an inability to remember the main subject being in discussion. And the second one, which I already talked about, is always keep track of the subject and always keep track of the master. And in politics, the master is power. And if you haven't seen it, I know I've recommended this before, but I highly recommend you take the time. It's like 20 minutes or so. It's my 7-year-old one of my 7-year-old daughter's favorite videos, actually, is Rules for Rulers by C.G.P. Gray. And he describes basically the problem of power in politics. If you think you can rule, a country better than its leaders are doing currently, it's probably because you don't understand how power works. The obligations that come with power based on how power is acquired and where power comes from in the political domain. And politicians are just as, well, not just as, are often as loyal to their sources of power in speech, unless you are Hillary Clinton, as they are in action. More loyal in action, usually. And that can be its own source of deception. A politician says that they will do one thing and then do something else because their obligations to their sources of power, to the keys to power. But the principle applies outside of politics too. If someone's master is an emotion or a loyalty or a memory, then their brain will almost always rationalize in defense of that. And so if you can spot that in someone else, if you can identify they have a deep attachment to this thing, they're never going to go against that. You can avoid a lot of pointless rabbit holes that won't go anywhere. And you can often steer around that and maybe find more fruitful conversations. But it's also important to remember about yourself too, because we all have masters. Some people say, well, my master is the truth. That might be kind of naive. It's a very noble ideal to strive for, but it's not something you can attain just by declaring it, contrary to The Office. You have to really work through your other existing masters, and maybe some of them are good. Maybe family is a higher master than truth. And if someone is not willing to betray their family to you in favor of truth, is that really a vice? What do they owe to you above their family? So, but it is an important point to bear in mind in looking at discussions like this, where the loyalties lead to tricky shifting in subjects by two master classes at Sneaky Language, in a particularly visible and educational manner. So, anyways, I hope that was interesting and edifying, and I hope it primes people to get more out of this interview, which again, I think is worth listening to, and especially worth watching if you get a chance. So thanks so much for listening, and take care.